I thought it would be just another late shift, one last inspection before the old wax museum closed forever. But the silence inside felt wrong, almost alive. When one of the figures whispered, "You're next," I knew I wasn't imagining it. That night, I learned some places don't stay empty after closing. Greetings, every shadow hides a story. Welcome. Under the bed. It happened 2 years ago, in the old wax museum on the east side of the city, a place that had once been crowded with tourists but had long since lost its charm. My name is Leo, I'm 30, and at that time I worked as a technician responsible for alarm systems and surveillance cameras. The museum was about to close forever, and my job was to check the wiring one last time before the power was cut off. It was supposed to be a quick, quiet evening shift. The museum stood at the end of a narrow street, behind an iron gate that creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was heavy and still, carrying that strange smell of old wax and dust. The receptionist, an elderly man named Carl, handed me the keys. "You'll be the last one tonight," he said, almost apologetically. "They're shutting off the electricity at 10. Lock the door when you're done." I nodded, pretending not to notice the way he avoided looking toward the exhibits. Once the front door closed behind me, silence wrapped around me like a blanket. The faint buzz of the lights echoed through the long corridor lined with figures frozen in mid-expression, politicians, movie stars, historical heroes. Their glassy eyes caught the dim light, making them look alive in the wrong way. I forced a laugh at my own nerves and started working on the first control panel. Every step I took echoed through the hall, bouncing off the walls and coming back slightly delayed, as if someone else was walking just a second behind me. I tried to focus on the cables, the sensors, the technical part. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. When I turned around, all I saw were faces made of wax, staring back in perfect stillness. Halfway through the inspection, I reached the Victorian room, a section filled with antique furniture and life-sized wax dolls. One of them, a woman in a red dress, was positioned oddly, slightly turned toward the wall instead of facing the center. It bothered me more than it should have. I adjusted her, aligning her with the rest. Her glass eyes seemed to glimmer as I stepped back. 15 minutes later, I returned through the same room. The figure in red was facing the wall again. For a moment, I froze, holding my flashlight still. There was no sound, no movement, nothing. I convinced myself it must have been my imagination, maybe I'd bumped her when passing earlier. But when I tried to move her again, the wax felt warmer than before. Almost like skin that had absorbed heat. My hands trembled a bit, but I forced myself to finish the job. The cameras, the alarms, everything checked out fine. Still, every time I looked at the monitors, I had the feeling that some of the figures weren't in quite the same position as before. It was subtle, a tilt of the head, a shift of shadow, but enough to keep my pulse racing. At one point, the lights flickered. A single bulb near the entrance blinked and went out. The sudden half-darkness made every shape in the hall seem to move slightly when I wasn't looking directly at it. I caught myself whispering, "Just finish the work, Leo," as if talking aloud could make the silence less dense. By 9:45 p.m., I was almost done. I took one last look around, ready to lock up. The figures stood perfectly still, but I couldn't shake the thought that something about their arrangement felt off, as if someone had walked among them after I'd passed. I double-checked the doors, noted the time, and turned off the main lights. As I walked toward the exit, the motion sensor light behind me blinked on for no reason. It shouldn't have. I turned, scanning the hall with my flashlight. Nothing moved. Only that same wax figure in red stood at the far end, faintly illuminated by the dying light. Her head was now slightly tilted toward me. The next evening, I was back at the museum. The management wanted the security footage copied before they shut down the servers, so I had to stay another few hours. The building felt even emptier than before, as if the air itself had thickened overnight. Outside, the city was drowned in fog, the kind that muffles every sound. When I unlocked the front door, it echoed through the entire hall, like stepping into a tomb. The lights flickered to life slowly, row by row, revealing the familiar stillness of wax faces frozen in their eternal poses. I told myself not to think about the red-dressed figure from last night, but the moment I entered the Victorian room, I couldn't help glancing at her. She was exactly where I'd left her, facing the center this time. Somehow that made it worse. I set up my laptop in the control room and connected it to the camera system. The monitors were arranged in a grid, each showing a different part of the museum: the main corridor, the gallery, the storage area, the Victorian room. Everything looked still, motionless. I began copying the files, the quiet hum of the hard drive the only sound around me. Then, at 7:42 p.m., one of the motion sensors blinked red for a second. It came from the Victorian room. I checked the feed, nothing moved. The figures stood exactly as before. I assumed it was just a bug, but to be sure, I rewound the recording about a minute. That's when I saw it. For less than 2 seconds, one of the wax dolls turned its head slightly toward the camera. It wasn't the red-dressed woman, it was the child figure beside her. The movement was so subtle that if you blinked, you'd miss it. I leaned closer to the screen, replayed the clip again and again, convinced my eyes were playing tricks. But the movement was real. Deliberate. I turned up the volume, expecting static, maybe background noise. Instead, a faint whisper slid through the speakers, words stretched and distorted, like something caught between two frequencies. I replayed that section over and over, until I made out the phrase, "You're next." My stomach dropped. For a full minute, I sat frozen, staring at the screen, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. I tried to reason it out, maybe a recording artifact, maybe someone had pranked the system years ago. But deep down, logic didn't feel enough. To calm myself, I decided to recheck the cameras manually. I walked through the hall with my flashlight, trying to match what I saw in person to what I'd seen on the monitors. The silence felt heavier with each step. My shoes tapped lightly against the wooden floor, the echo bouncing back from the glass cases. When I reached the Victorian room again, everything looked unchanged. The child figure stood next to the woman in red. Both motionless. I forced myself to stand there for a full minute, just watching. My eyes burned from not blinking, waiting for even the slightest movement. Nothing. I turned off the light and walked out. Back in the control room, I checked the live feed again, and froze. The red-dressed woman was now turned slightly toward the door. I was sure she hadn't been like that moments ago. I switched to another camera angle to make sure, same thing. Her body faced forward, but her head tilted toward the entrance, almost as if she was watching me leave. The power flickered for a moment, the monitors dimming. When they came back on, every figure on the screens looked the same. Still. Dead still. I rubbed my face, realizing I was sweating even though the room was cold. My own reflection in the dark monitor glass looked pale and unreal. By 9 o'clock, I'd finished copying the footage. I shut down the system and packed my bag, eager to get out. But before leaving, I glanced one last time at the monitors. All quiet. I exhaled and turned away. That's when a sound came from the speaker, a faint, breathy voice, right behind me. Not from the hallway, not from the building, from the monitor itself. It whispered the same words I'd heard earlier, but clearer this time, right next to my ear. "You're next." I spun around so fast I knocked over my chair. The room was empty. Only the static hiss of the disconnected monitors filled the air. I stared at the blank screens for what felt like an eternity, then forced myself to lock up and step outside. The fog outside had thickened even more. My car's headlights barely reached the gate. For a moment, before leaving, I looked back through the glass doors at the museum's main hall. The emergency lights inside glowed faintly, just enough to reveal one detail that made my throat tighten. The red-dressed figure was no longer facing the center of the room. She was facing the entrance. The following night, I couldn't shake the thought of what I'd seen on those recordings. Logic told me it was nothing more than interference, a glitch, maybe caused by magnetic noise or corrupted data. But the whisper, the way that figure seemed to move when no one was watching, had dug into my mind. I told myself I'd go back one last time, just to prove everything was fine. To prove that I wasn't losing it. I arrived around 8:30. The city was quiet, cold, and wrapped in mist again. The streets around the museum were completely empty. I parked beside the gate, unlocked it, and stepped inside. The key turned with a faint metallic click that echoed down the hall. The museum felt colder than before, the kind of cold that comes not from temperature, but from absence, as if something had drawn all warmth out of the walls. I switched on the main lights, but only half of them came to life. The others flickered, buzzed, then died, leaving certain corners shrouded in dim orange glow. I took a deep breath and told myself it didn't matter, I just needed to test the doors, reset the system, and leave. I began my routine check from the main hall, moving toward the Victorian room. As I walked, I noticed something strange, a faint smell of burnt wax. It reminded me of candles that had just been blown out. The air was heavier, thicker. Each step seemed louder than it should be. When I reached the Victorian room, the red-dressed woman was gone. My heart skipped. I froze where I stood, scanning every corner. The child figure remained in place, staring at the empty space beside it. The air felt suddenly wrong, as if the room itself was holding its breath. I rushed to the control panel to check the internal lock. Maybe one of the staff had moved her earlier and forgotten to tell me. But the museum had been empty for 2 days. I was the only one with keys. Trying to stay calm, I decided to finish the inspection before looking for her. I went back through the main corridor and into the exhibit of historical figures. The silence was almost unbearable. I could hear the faint hum of the lights, the creak of the floor under my shoes, and somewhere in the distance, a sound like slow, deliberate footsteps. I stopped walking. The noise stopped too. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the empty building. "Carl? Anyone here?" No answer. Just the faint echo of my own words. I turned toward the entrance, ready to leave, but when I tried the door handle, it didn't move. The lock was jammed. I twisted harder, using both hands, but it stayed firm. Panic started to crawl in. I checked my phone, no signal. Not even one bar. The air felt heavier with every breath. I could hear something faint now, a creaking sound coming from the direction of the Victorian room. It was slow and rhythmic, like someone walking barefoot across the wooden floor. I turned on my flashlight and moved carefully down the corridor. The beam cut through the shadows, illuminating rows of wax faces, soldiers, kings, strangers. Each one seemed to lean slightly toward me as I passed. My pulse hammered in my ears. When I reached the Victorian room again, the smell of wax was stronger. My light swept across the room, and there she was. The woman in red stood near the far wall, her head tilted slightly toward me. I hadn't seen her there a moment ago. For several seconds, I couldn't move. The figure looked different now, the tilt of the head more human, the shadows deeper around her eyes. My mind screamed to leave, but my body wouldn't listen. I forced myself to step closer, one slow step at a time, until I stood just a few feet away. Her face was perfect. Too perfect. The paint on her lips seemed newer than the rest, glossier. There was even a tiny speck of dust clinging to one eyelash, as if she had blinked. I raised my flashlight, the beam reflecting off the glassy eyes, and for an instant, I thought I saw them move. Just a fraction, enough to make my throat tighten. A loud clang shattered the silence, something metal falling in the corridor behind me. I turned, shining the light toward the sound, but saw nothing. When I turned back, the figure was closer. I stumbled backward, my shoulder hitting the wall. My flashlight flickered, then steadied again. She hadn't moved, not really. Maybe it was my eyes, maybe the light. I didn't know anymore. I backed out of the room, refusing to look away from her until I was out of sight. My only thought was to get to the side exit, maybe it wasn't locked. But as I reached it and pulled the handle, it too was jammed tight. That's when I heard it again, a whisper, soft but close, right behind me. "You're next." I turned so fast I almost fell, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. No one was there. Only the faint outlines of the wax figures at the end of the hall, standing in perfect stillness. Then the lights flickered again, once, twice, and went out completely. The emergency backup light came on, dim and red, just enough to cast long shadows across the floor. Among them, I saw a new one, a human-shaped shadow that didn't belong to me. It stood halfway down the hall, perfectly still. I didn't breathe. Didn't move. The shadow shifted. When the lights went out, I froze. For a few seconds, the only sound was the slow, steady hum of the emergency generator kicking in. The red light filled the hall, painting the wax faces around me in deep shadows. My flashlight was still trembling in my hand, the beam shaking with every heartbeat. The shadow I'd seen was gone. Or maybe it had never been there. I forced myself to breathe. I had to think clearly, not panic. The building was old, maybe the power failure had triggered the locks. I told myself that if I could reach the control room and reset the system, the doors might open again. That became my only goal. The corridor stretched ahead like a tunnel, each display case reflecting that faint crimson glow. I moved slowly, scanning every corner, every figure, whispering under my breath just to hear a human voice. When I reached the intersection near the central exhibit, something caught my eye, a smear on the floor, faint but visible in the red light. It looked like a line of wax dragged across the tiles. I crouched down and touched it. It was soft, warm, and smelled faintly of perfume, the same scent I'd noticed around the woman in the red dress. My throat tightened. I lifted my flashlight, sweeping it across the floor. The trail led down the hallway toward the main door. I followed it, my steps silent on the cold tiles. The trail ended near the entrance, right next to the exit sign, and that's where I saw her. The red-dressed figure stood by the door, perfectly posed, her head tilted toward the handle. I hadn't moved her. No one had. I whispered, "How?" The word barely left my mouth. I took a slow step forward, trying to convince myself this was some kind of prank, maybe a staged setup left over from an old exhibit. But the air felt heavy, thick with something unexplainable. I noticed something new, a small bronze plate on the wall beside the display. It had probably been there all along, but I'd never paid attention before. The plate read, "Unknown donor, 1954. I frowned. I'd memorized most of the museum's layout by now, and I didn't recall any unknown donor. Each figure usually had a description, who made it, what it represented. This one had none. The lettering was old, tarnished, nearly unreadable. My hands were shaking as I pointed the flashlight at her face again. The expression seemed different now, not a smile, not a frown, just something faintly human, like the trace of a thought caught mid-sentence. Her eyes seemed to follow the beam of my light. Then came a sound, faint but clear, from behind the glass partition to my left. It was the security display monitor inside a locked showcase. The screen, though the power was supposedly down, flickered for a second and showed a frozen image from one of the cameras. The Victorian room. There was movement in the frame. I leaned closer, squinting at the dim screen. The child figure that had stood next to the red-dressed woman was no longer there. The frame showed only the empty pedestal where it had been, the small chair beside it overturned. My chest felt tight. I turned around instinctively, scanning the hallway. My flashlight passed over the walls, the door, the silent figures, and then stopped. The child figure was there. Right behind the woman in red. It stood half hidden in her shadow, head tilted upward as if looking at her. Its wax hands were stretched slightly forward, palms open. I didn't remember it ever being positioned that way. A sudden noise behind me made me jump, a door slamming somewhere deeper in the museum. I spun around, breathing hard. The air moved, stirring dust that glittered in the beam of my flashlight. For the first time, I realized how deep the silence was. No hum from the lights, no sound from outside, nothing. I backed away slowly, refusing to look away from them. My shoulder brushed against the wall, and my flashlight flickered for a split second. When it came back on, the woman's head was turned. Now she was looking straight at me. I froze in place. My mind screamed to run, but my body wouldn't move. The red glow made her look alive. Veins of melted wax glistened on her neck, almost like they were pulsing. I took a slow step backward, then another. The beam shook across her face, over her glassy eyes, and for a brief instant, I saw her lips part slightly, like someone about to speak. My flashlight went out. Total darkness. I pressed the switch over and over until the beam returned, weak but enough to see the door. I didn't hesitate. I ran toward it, the sound of my footsteps loud and frantic. I pulled the handle again and again, still locked. My heart hammered against my ribs. Behind me came the quiet sound of something moving, not footsteps, more like wax dragging across the floor. I didn't dare turn around. I just stood there, gripping the handle, breathing in short, broken gasps. The whisper came again, closer than ever, right next to my ear. "You're next." I turned, ready to see her standing behind me, but the hall was empty. Every figure was in its place, perfectly still. Only one thing had changed: the red-dressed woman was gone. The child figure remained, standing alone by the door, its small wax hand reaching toward me. My flashlight flickered again, then died completely. In the red emergency light, the walls seemed to breathe. I could feel the air moving, warm and faintly sweet, like melting wax. I stumbled back, searching for the nearest room, the control center, anywhere with a lock I could close. My vision blurred, every shadow twisting into something alive. When I finally reached the main office, I slammed the door and dropped to the floor, pressing my back against it. I stayed there until dawn. When the first gray light slipped through the blinds, I opened the door and looked down the hall. The figure stood as before, silent and harmless. The woman in red was gone. But on the floor near the exit lay a small, bronze nameplate, the one that had read "Unknown Donor." It was bent, and beneath the old engraving, faint letters had been scratched in, fresh and sharp. Leo. When the first morning light finally broke through the dusty windows, I could barely stand. My head was spinning, and my clothes were damp with cold sweat. The museum was silent again, perfectly ordinary, as if the night had been a hallucination. I forced myself to walk out, leaving the main keys on the desk. The air outside felt thin and unreal, like I was waking from a dream I couldn't escape. I drove home without turning on the radio, without thinking, just staring at the empty streets sliding past the windshield. Every few seconds, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that red-dressed figure sitting in the back seat. But there was nothing, only my pale reflection. That afternoon, the museum's management called. They thanked me for finishing the inspection and told me the museum would be permanently closed that day. "You did good work," the voice said. "We won't need you anymore." I didn't argue. I just wanted to forget the whole thing. But I couldn't. Something inside me needed to know whether any of it had been real. So, the next morning, I drove back, just once more, I told myself. The front gate was already chained, but the side door was unlocked. Inside, the place smelled of dust and cold wax. The silence was deeper than before. It felt like the museum was already dead. The control room still had power. I turned on the monitors. The last recordings from the night before were still on the system. My hands shook as I scrolled through the files until I found the timestamp from around 3 in the morning, when I'd heard the whisper. The screen flickered, and there I was, walking quickly through the hall toward the office. The footage was grainy but clear enough. I watched myself stop, look over my shoulder, then sprint out of frame. But there was something else, something moving in the far corner of the image. A faint shape, human-like, stepping out of the shadows. It followed me slowly, step for step. I rewound it and played it again. The figure was tall, covered in what looked like a dress. The same red one. It followed until I disappeared into the office, then stopped in the middle of the hall and turned toward the camera. The face was featureless for a moment, blurred by the motion. Then, as the image stabilized, I saw it clearly. It was my face. I pulled back from the screen, my chest tight, trying to breathe. It didn't make sense. I rewound again, frame by frame. The figure's head lifted, the features forming more sharply, the mouth opening, just enough for a whisper I couldn't hear through the speakers. Then the image glitched, the screen cut to black, and the recording ended. When I opened the system log, I noticed one more file, timestamped 5 minutes after that recording. The file was unlabeled. I clicked it. The camera view was from the main entrance. A person, me, walked toward the door, unlocked it, and stepped outside. But then something strange happened. Another me remained standing inside, perfectly still, watching the first one leave. The lights flickered, and the second figure turned toward the camera. The screen froze. A loud noise echoed through the empty hallway behind me, a single, hollow knock, like something hitting glass. I turned slowly toward the window separating the control room from the corridor. The faint light from the monitors reflected my face. But behind that reflection, in the dim hallway, stood a figure. Same height. Same shape. Same clothes. I didn't move. The figure didn't either. For a few seconds, we stood like mirrors. Then its head tilted slightly, not quite human in the motion. My reflection didn't move. I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. I turned off the monitors, grabbed my things, and walked out without looking back. The front door opened easily this time. I didn't question how. Outside, dawn was breaking again. The fog had lifted, and the street was empty. I locked the gate behind me and threw the keys into the drain. That should have been the end of it. But that night, as I sat in my apartment trying to write a report for my company, my laptop screen flickered. For a split second, I saw the museum's control room on the display, the monitors glowing faintly, showing empty halls. And in one of those screens, I saw myself, standing there, exactly as I'd looked 2 nights ago. The screen blinked again, and the image vanished. I stared at my own reflection in the dark window beside the desk. The city lights shimmered faintly outside. My reflection smiled. But I didn't. The next morning, the news reported that the old wax museum had been completely destroyed in a fire before dawn. Authorities said it started somewhere near the control room. No one was inside, they claimed. No signs of break-in, no missing persons. Just a burned-out shell and melted figures. Still, a week later, a city worker cleaning the debris found something that didn't burn, a single bronze nameplate lying among the ashes. It read, "LEO, Technician, 2023. No one could explain where it came from.